Okay, on to our next presentation. Again, we have a proxy here. So the author is Sebastian Soulet, but they will be presented by Robert Sussman here, because Sebastian can't make it. Robert is correct me again if I'm wrong, senior researcher and lecturer at the Institute for Nuclear Sciences at the National University of Mexico, if I remember correct. And the title of the presentation is Reviews of Overheating Ends Aerosols, Recent Updates.
I would like to thank the organizer for the opportunity to share my presentation today. This presentation, titled Reviews of Overheating ENDS Aerosol, Recent Update, is a summary of 3 years of collaborative effort with my colleague Roberto Sussman and me, Sebastian Soulet. As a starting point, we began to look at the chemical analysis of aerosol, as they are the main approach to characterize the risk of ENDS used, and we evaluated the condition of generation regarding their consistency. One of the first articles which began to warn ourselves that irrelevant conditions are more and more used to generate emission was a paper published in 2019 where authors used a sub-ohm device at 40 watt, 120 watt and 200 watts using the ISO 2768 vaping regime, unless it was initially recommended between 20 and 50 watt for direct lung inhalation. Our result highlighted that at 200 watts and 120 watts levels of formaldehydes were 750 times and 130 times higher than at 40 watts. Therefore, we conduct a review of paper looking firstly for metal and metalloids in emission and then for aldehydes, carbon monoxide and free radicals in a second review. Despite the lack of details provided on the condition of generation, there is an evident systematization of high-power device used with a low vaping regime. Therefore, our next step would obviously to review papers carrying biological testing, even more because this kind of experiment is used to share emotion as fear by media. One example, which was the starting point of our review, was an article published in 2022 using pregnant mice to observe the impact of ENDS aerosol on their offspring. As observable, the results were clearly extracted to human babies by media and is used by anti-vaping groups. Our inquiry through this first article highlighted that an equipment sold by CIREC is used as a vaping machine. Despite the limited information provided, we found more details in internet. More precisely, a video published by CIREC allowed us to understand how emissions are generated. A sub-tank is used as a reference device at the highest power that can be fixed on the box, 70 watts, despite it is recommended between 15 and 50 watts. First, a suspicion. Interestingly, another detail warned ourselves. Initially, the liquid in the tank was incolored, and at the end of the experiment, the liquid was brown. This is a sign of advanced overheating condition where the cotton is pyrolyzed and released furan, which gives this brown color. This is where we started to head down the rabbit hole to discover the wonderland. As a first step, we wanted to characterize the device and highlighted that the overheating condition started to occur at 30 watts using the Coresta vaping regime. As a comparison, at 45 watts, formaldehyde has increased by more than 20 times the level at 30 watts, and the increasing is also valuable for the other compounds. We also compare the use of a low or a high vaping regime more consistent with direct lung inhalation. As observable, the optimal range is significantly higher. Despite higher quantities of e-liquid or vaporized, they are vaporized under optimal condition until 63 watts. It means that the direct lung inhalation is required for the functioning of the device, otherwise overheating condition occurs at early powers, which means an increasing of the risk for the user. So we moved further and decided to review the papers that used this equipment with the specific coil of 0.15 ohm. At the end of our inquiry, we found 41 articles that potentially used the condition. I say potentially because 11 don't provide any information except the reference to the CIREC equipment and to the CIREC video. 27 provide few details, allowing to suspect that they operated under the targeted condition, and only 3 clearly details how emissions were generated. A way to illustrate the bibliometric result is to observe the author's connection. Interestingly, 17 isolated groups of researchers were identified with one core group. This core group collaborated with CIREC to make the presentation video of the equipment, and the other 16 groups just reproduced their protocol. It should be pointed that an average of 2 new papers under the same condition are published each year. It means that even after our review would be published, new paper will be published under the same condition. We finally extended our inquiry to other papers dealing with in vitro or in vivo testing using irrelevant conditions to generate ENDS aerosol. 69 papers were found using very high powers with a too low airflow rate, fostering overheating condition. This characterization will be replicated in the future. One group found a specific interest as they published around 20 papers the last 8 years. The systematization of high-power device use can be highlighted through their papers. In 2016 and 2018, they only used a low-power device. In 2019 and 2020, they used their low-power device with a new high-power device. Since the low-power device has lost of interest and the high-power device remained alone since 2022. It can also be raised that this group of researchers conduct experiments with liquid doped with drugs that are a health issue. The point we wanted to raise is that the literature abounds of irrelevant experiments. At this step, we collected around 200 papers with both chemical and biological testing. Overheating conditions are an easy way to provide overestimated risk of ENDS use, and this data coming mainly from US academic labs are collected by governmental agencies, while in the same time, data from industry are pushed to the side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I think that's a good example of sometimes in science you can, let's say, set your experiment to get the answer you want. Questions, please, Robert.
It doesn't have to be a technical question, any question.
Yes, please, Maria.
What's the importance of this type of study?
Well, we are showing how you can have a tendency of that involves hundreds of studies that perhaps inadvertently, I think so, or by incompetence, by not knowing how the devices work, you generate a tendency of scientific studies that predict harms in terms of chemical compounds and exposure of biological systems. But the biological protocols are excellent, are okay. The problem is that the aerosol that is generated is an aerosol that for a human user would be absolutely repellent. And it is a tendency. We have spotted 200 papers, but we are sure that this is a tip of the iceberg, and it is in one issue. So this is, and why is this important? Because when regulators or politicians want to decide on policies regarding vaping, and it applies also to heated tobacco products, is not so different, they look at studies that have examined the chemical composition of the aerosol, also the effect of this aerosol on biological systems. And I'm not saying that a politician or the FDI will say, oh, that study found formaldehyde or nickel or copper, so is going to make a decision on that paper. Maybe not a decision in terms of 10 or 20 or 100 papers, but this amount of studies make a sort of environmental noise. Yeah, we shall have a word like cacophony, right? There's a cacophony of risk around there. It's not one specific paper, but it's a collection of papers. And this is something that is a tendency that is going on, and it influences the regulation, the popular perception of. Yesterday, I met a group of colleagues who are astrophysicists. They have nothing to do with this topic. And they saw me with my vaporizer, and they say, watch out, this is dangerous. Watch out. Because they know I'm a former smoker. Say, no, go, no. And I have to explain. And these are people with PhDs in physics. So this cacophony of harm that is floating around has a very strong influence on regulation. And this is the main importance. You have to uncover that. And it is not easy to do because it's technical. A lot of people do not have the training to uncover this sort of, I would say it, chemical cheating, or well, I don't know the right term in English, but we say in Spanish, cuchareo químico. We have to expose it, and this is the importance. Besides the technical detail, I would like to people to not be afraid, ask questions. We'll be happy to answer.
Ariel Celia from Pinney Associates, and we consult for Juul. Thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering, and maybe I missed it in your presentation, but out of the 200 or so studies that you found, what percentage of them were under unrealistic operating conditions? And why do you think that arose? Do you think it's just genuine ignorance about operating conditions, or do you think it's more confirmation bias influencing the study design?
Yeah, well, the proportion, like the 200 that we have revised, I would say that 160 are generating an aerosol that has no relevance for real life. It depends. For example, in metals, the proportion is higher. In carbonyls and organic byproducts, it is more even. Because, again, we also have to mention that in order to generate the examples that generated the overheated aerosol are easily identified by using high-power devices with a very low airflow. Translated into human beings, this would be one of these monster vaporizers with an inhalation that you would use for a Joule. If you have tried that as a human being, you would burn, the aerosol would burn you, right? So this runs against the demographic tendency, because high power devices reached a peak around 2017, 18, and then decayed. Today, about 95% of vapers use low power devices, right? So in those who measure carbonyls are more attuned to the real demographic usage, and so this problem would not manifest. There are other problems that we detail in our reviews, but not this one, right? So what proportion of all of them? Now, in the case of cell and mouse studies, we, we have seen already about 100 and more than 100 studies, and all of them can be thrown to the rubbish. No, I have to be honest. And but this is just we have not seen. We are talking about a large base of studies, and of course we have not sampled all of them. But there is a sizable proportion. I must also say all these studies are funded by public health organizations, the NIH, the FDA's Tobacco Center, European organizations. We have also looked at industry studies, and industry studies. Let me say that it's not because you are industry, but industry studies are of much better quality normally, right? So this is a phenomenon of sociology of science. Yes, and you are right. It's not necessarily incompetence. It's a mixture. It's a mixture of different causes.
Claude Van Berger from EDUS in France. In your experience, you are not the whole field of science, but in your experience, how many published studies speak about a product outside of the field of vaping, of course, without reading the manual?
You mean
I mean the vaping power, the recommended vaping power, and the use of the product is written on the resistance itself.
Yes.
To be clear, it's like driving a car at 300 kilometers per hour, and explaining it can be dangerous sometimes.
Now you touch a very interesting and important point. So if I'm going to expose mice to some aerosol and I have why don't they read the manuals? Well, the point is that we have read the manuals. For every device that we have reviewed, we have looked at the manuals. They are available. You can download them, except that there is no description on how the values that are stated in the manual as limiting values of power or resistance or whatever, there is no explanation how they get it, right? And we have tested experimentally we have a criterion to define the optimal regime of a vaping device. And it is based on the thermodynamics, it is based on thermal physics, and it can be reproduced in the laboratory. And we have seen that many times the manuals do not agree. They roughly agree, but unfortunately the manufacturers, and here we are angry with the industry because they provide very little information on how these values are generated. But some articles are so far off, like Sebastiaen mentioned the first case of a metal study testing a device that should be testing a device that is recommended, and also we confirmed that experimentally around 40 watts, and they tested at 220 watts. Those authors, they really did not read the manual. You know, even among these authors, you find some of them that you really want to tell them, come on, guys, This is cheating. And some others, but it's true what you say.
That scientific papers and science is very important and very true because of peer reviews and process and repetition and all that. Is it true? For example, is this phenomenon you observed? I see it in vaping, of course, because I'm in this subject. And for example, we published the documentation those people should have read. It's very strange because we are consumers, but does it exist in other fields?
Yeah, that's an important point. The emission studies, either the ones that just test emissions or expose biological systems, use machines. There are very few. Farsalinos has published a few ones. The Dutch RIVM also incorporated vapors in some studies. But it's true, it would be very useful if they use human volunteers to taste and test the aerosol. Because that's also important, because the manufacturer will tell you that this device has to be used between, I don't know, 20 and 40 watts. But this is not the whole information, because the same level of power will have different effects with a different airflow. So, and this goes to the point that high power devices must be used with direct lung, because that's a very large airflow that balances and keeps the thermodynamical parameters in the right position, right? But if some manufacturers will tell you, use this device only if you have expertise and if you use direct lung. But some manuals don't tell you anything. So it's a generic problem that also affects industry.
Okay.
It's a problem of standards.
I think we'll have to call it a day there, Roberto. I think this is one that could spill over into the lunch break as well, the discussion. So, but thank you very much. Really, really interesting.